Dear brothers and sisters, arguably the most difficult question of faith is theodicy, is the question of why. Now if you go through the pillars and the arkan of Iman, then you see that the last of the articles of faith is the belief in the qada and qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the belief in the divine decree and the predestination of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that is the pillar, as Abdullah bin Abbas radiallahu anhu says, that if a person establishes it, then they establish their tawheed, and if a person destroys it, then they destroy their tawheed. It is the most difficult thing to wrap our heads around, the most difficult things for our hearts to accept, the most difficult thing for us to stomach when we see tragedies unfolding before our eyes, the way we see Aleppo, Halab unfolding before our eyes. And quite frankly, without the belief in Allah and without the belief in the Akhirah, the belief in the hereafter, nothing makes sense. Nothing makes sense. Interestingly enough, when you go through the Quran, Allah stresses belief in Allah and belief in the hereafter. You don't see stress as much as you do on those things in belief in al-qada wal-qadr, belief in divine decree, even though that is the pillar in the article that most people will struggle with. And there is a very important reason for that. Because just as without a strong belief in Allah and the hereafter, nothing makes sense, with a strong belief in Allah and the hereafter, everything makes sense. Everything is digestible. Everything is acceptable. Everything is tranquil. Even in the greatest times of chaos and havoc, everything can be resolved with the belief in Allah and with the belief in the hereafter. And that's why Allah stresses it. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Man amana billahi wal yawm al-akhir," whoever believes in Allah and the last day, everything comes in between those two. So He sends His angels to His messengers with messages to preach the belief in Allah and the belief in the hereafter. And that resolves the problem of that question. So when we talk about the believers and those that go through difficulty in this life and are unfairly tormented for their belief in Allah or never see the fruits of their faith in this world, then we remember that as Allah tells us in the Quran, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُضِيعُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Allah does not let the good deeds of the believers go to waste. Two implications in there. Number one, a God who rewards. Number two, a time after this time in which that reward would be fully realized. When a person suffers, whether that suffering is something that's due to a disease or an illness, or it's due to oppression or transgression, Allah will not let their patience go unrewarded. Allah will reward their patience in ways that cannot be quantified. But then what about on the other side, those that transgress and the oppressors? Do not think that Allah is unaware of what the oppressors do. Allah delays them to a day. As the Prophet ﷺ says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَيُمْلِي لِلظَّالِمِ حَتَّى إِذَا أَخَذَهُ لَمْ يُفْلِتْهُ. That Allah delays the oppressor until He snatches him and He never lets him go. In all of these ayat, in all of these ahadith are the two very important implications that strengthen that belief in divine decree and that strengthen our belief and allow us to proceed through this life in a way that, yes, we are saddened by events that unfold before us, but in a way that we are also proactive about dealing with what we can deal with. Humanity starts wars and humanity ignores wars. Humanity allows for the death and destruction of over 250,000 people. In the last 5 years in Syria, 11 million displaced people, refugees, living all over the place and being dealt with cruelty. Humanity caused that and humanity ignored that. There is an oppressor and there are the silent observers. Those that have power and those that don't have power. Governments that could have intervened but did not intervene. And people that watched in silence and allowed that to unfold. And quite frankly, some people who were completely unfazed by it. Some people who chose to ignore it altogether. And when humanity messes up and humanity murders, people kill, people watch others being killed, people oppress, people watch others being oppressed, then what do we do after that? We ask God why He let it happen. How did you allow this after we messed it all up? We turn towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with our complaints. So on one hand, we want the free will to be able to reject God, to reject His orders, to reject His revelation, to reject His legislation, to live free without any restrictions. We reject when He calls us to charity and generosity and benevolence and mercy. and to take care of the poor and the vulnerable amongst us. But then at the same time, while we're rejecting God and we want to be free, we also want God to not let us be too free. We want Him to referee us, and we want Him to stop us when our free will gets us out of hand. Isn't that hypocrisy? Isn't that a double standard? Oh Allah, don't force us to do good, but when we mess up too bad, force us to stop being evil, to turn it back towards Him after we try to demand our freedom of choice. So if God stopped evil, and if God did not give us the ability to do wrong, we know that Allah doesn't force us to do wrong. That's a batil creed. That's a false creed. As false as the creed that says Allah doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We know Allah doesn't force us to do wrong. But if God stopped evil, then we wouldn't have free will. Then we wouldn't have choices. Then that would defeat the purpose of the entire human enterprise. Then we might as well be angels or robots. Either God forces us to worship Him, and it's, we have no desires, we have no inclinations. Or we're robots, just like a doll or something you push. Push the button of love. It's not real love, even though the doll keeps saying, I love you to the child. It's a doll, it's robotic, it's not real. So on one hand, do we want God to stop us? Or on the other hand, do we want God to let us completely go free to where we will ruin ourselves and where we completely mess up? So if we don't have free will and God stops all this evil, when we blame it all on Him, when humanity messes it up, then what's the point of this world? Is there such thing as freedom without choice? Or do we really just not want other people to have free will and other people to have choice? Because we've somehow convinced ourselves that we're not that bad. And if we were in the position of government and authority and dictatorship, then we would be better than those that we criticize. If we were in that position of power, we would be so different. So ya Allah, let us continue to try to climb the ladder of our own professions and our own careers and our own pursuits of power, but don't let them get it. How does that make sense? Aren't we creating more problems than solutions in that case? And subhanAllah, when we think about even the idea of how we recognize good and evil, because to resolve this and say, well, maybe there is no God. Maybe we just all got here. Maybe this entire complex design, all of our DNA that's been written, all of our functions, all of that is all by accident. Maybe we're just here, and the proof of that is how bad we've screwed it up. That's the proof of how that there is no God. But the fact that you can recognize good and evil, and you can recognize oppression versus goodness and generosity is a proof of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fact that that makes you uncomfortable, if you're a decent human being, seeing dying children makes you uncomfortable, and you can recognize what is good and what is bad, that's a proof of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in and of itself. That He gave you the ability to recognize. But people, humanity, human beings decide to stop being human and neglect those things. But the fact of the matter is that when we become so powerful, when we find ourselves in positions of authority, often we are not godlike anymore. We are not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us to be. We lose our own sense of purpose. And all of those questions about evil and hardship and pain, and why does this happen, and why does that happen, the vast majority of it can directly be traced back to what humanity does wrong. Moral evil, our own selfishness, our own intoxication with power, our own deliberate ignoring of the world's problems around us, our own gluttony and luxury and enjoying the things that we've been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's face it, poverty doesn't bother you that much until you're in poverty, until you start to feel the pinch. Hunger doesn't bother you that much until other people, or until you feel some hunger. Oppression doesn't bother you that much as long as it's in another land. So when we think about the evil around the world, how much of it can directly be traced back to us as people? There's enough food in the world for every single member of the human race to have a 3,000 calorie diet. But we don't care about that until we ourselves feel the pinch of that hunger. And then you talk about the other evil. But what about this and what about that? And there are good people that just suffer, inexplicably suffer. It doesn't make any sense. Wallahi, the most shocking thing about meeting those Syrian refugees, about going through the camps of the Syrian refugees, these are people who have lost everything. Everything. It's unbelievable how much they've lost. Family, wealth, possessions, everything, their career, everything. And subhanAllah, they are more content than we are. They complain less about life than we do. They're telling us Allah will give us more in the hereafter. No wonder why the Prophet ﷺ said, the majority of the people of Jannah are the fuqara and the masakin. The majority of the people of paradise are the poor and the downtrodden. They get it. It hurts, but they get it. And they're telling us, entitled, privileged, rich, spoiled Americans, that it's okay. Allah knows. Allah will give us. Allah is great. We know that what awaits us in the hereafter is better than that which we have lost in this world. Allah did not ignore them. We did. We did. How much are you giving? Ma'ziratan ila rabbikum. Just an excuse before the Lord that I've tried to do my part. Whether it's lobbying for them, whether it's raising their voices for them, whether it's giving charity to them, whether it's making dua for them. What have I done for them? And that's a question we have to ask ourselves each and every single time we see tragedy unfold before our eyes and we see innocent people being killed. What can I do? What am I doing? The rest is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I am assured in Allah's plan, but I'm not assured in my own efforts. What can I do different? And so when these things unfold, Allah's kingdom does not decrease at all, but our humanity does. Our humanity does. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to be in the service of people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow our hearts to be such that we don't ignore the suffering of those around us or those that are far from us, but that we engage with it, that we feel empathy for it, and that we do what is in our capacity to do for it. Nothing more except for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and out of gratitude for what He's given to us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be with our brothers and sisters all over the world that are suffering. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to alleviate their pain. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be instruments by which He alleviates their pain. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow to stop the oppressors from their oppression. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to stop the oppressors from their oppression. We ask Allah to guide us to where we are not oppressors and we are stopping other oppressors. Allahumma ameen.